Well, we'll be talking with Robin Grossinger from the San Francisco Estuary Institute. His presentation is Making Nature's City, Using Historical Ecology and Urban Ecology to Bring Biodiversity Back to Our Cities. This presentation will explore how native plant gardens can be connected to the surrounding ecological landscape to maximize the benefits to urban biodiversity. We'll look at how we can learn from the local landscape, both past and present, to guide complementary actions at the garden, neighborhood, and city scale. Robin Grossinger is a senior scientist at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, where he directs SFEI's Urban Nature Lab. His work was recently featured in a global urban lecture by the United Nations. Robin has been recognized with a Local Hero Award from Bay Nature magazine, and his work has been featured by media from NPR to the New York Times. Robin is a former colleague of mine as we worked together at the San Francisco Estuary Institute many years ago. Hi, Robin. Are you with us, Robin?
Yes.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
I can. Let me stop sharing my screen. That will allow you to join us here. So I love history, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Yes. Well, thanks. It's great to be here, Kathy.
So I know you spent quite a bit of time looking at old maps, reading historical descriptions about the Bay Area, and thinking about what it was like here 300 years ago. Shall we just leap right into your talk?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead then, Robin.
Okay, so I can share now. It looks like I don't have access to share yet.
Okay, I should probably stop sharing my screen. Let me see how I do that. Can you help me?
So Kathy, all you need to do is right click on Robin's name under panelists and give him co-hosting privileges, which will allow him to share his screen.
Okay. All right. There, now you should be enabled.
Yes. Okay. Okay, it's loading. Can you see my first slide there? Is that showing up? Okay, I'm going to assume it is.
I can see it, yeah.
Thank you so much, Kathy. It's great to be part of the tour. It's just a fantastic event. And, you know, in a way, what I'll be talking about is giving a bit of a science context and sort of support for a lot of the things that I see all of these great leaders in urban ecology are already doing. So, but yeah, I think my job here is to step back and think about how do we maximize biodiversity, or the contribution of our yard and our neighborhood to the ecology of our area, and like how does that yard play a role in bringing back some of the lost landscapes and functions that we have lost in our cities. So as Kathy mentioned, I've spent, I guess, 25 years now researching the historical ecology of California and learning about what we lost, the landscapes we had, like these wetlands and riverine, broad riparian corridors of the Delta, and thinking about how we can get them back, or elements or components, functional aspects. The beaches of San Francisco Bay, here is a view looking at Albany Hill and in the East Bay, where Golden Gate Fields and the freeway are today. You know, or the vast valley oak savannas of the South Bay, which turned into orchards, which turned into residential communities, or the oaks of Oakland, the unique land of oaks that, and this is the same intersection as that painting. And while we clearly can't get back the big former wetlands and rivers and kind of wildlands in the cities, we're going to need South Bay salt ponds and delta restoration and all the great work we're doing in the uplands for those places. We did start to realize that there were a lot of things in the lowlands, in the developed areas, that we've lost that aren't necessarily going to come back in those other areas. So this is a historical mapping of Santa Clara Valley. And you can see the oak savannas in the orangish yellow, the grassland wildflower meadows in the yellowish, beigeish light green are wet meadows, the dark green are the giant willow groves, riparian corridors, and the blue wetlands. And many of these features aren't going to come back in the hills. They're missing elements of the landscape that we need to bring back as best we can in the urban setting. So we start to realize as we go from that and realize the lost legacy in the contemporary landscape that conservation in the urban areas is kind of a missing piece between the great work we're doing around the bay and the great work we're doing in the hills. We need to do better in the areas where we live. And in fact, we recently published a paper in Bioscience led by my colleague Erica Spotswood, addressing what what you might call the biological deserts fallacy of cities, which is the idea that cities are inherently just going to be bad for biodiversity. And it's true, developing a city is bad for the habitats that used to be there. But once we have cities, how they're designed can actually affect their ability. They can actually make many positive contributions to regional biodiversity. And so this paper documents those from research around the world and the different pathways for supporting, for making positive contributions. Those can be, as this diagram shows, stopover habitat for migratory species, which have to pass through the city and need to find resources along the way to continue their calorie consuming flights. Or the middle bullet there, increasing regional habitat heterogeneity. Essentially what I just talked about, that there's things we can get and resources that can be provided in the cities that you often can't get in the other areas. Also, there's an interesting phenomenon where in cities, there's a lot of challenges for wildlife, but they can be removed from some pressures. For example, valley oaks tend to regenerate better in more developed areas than they do in the wildlands, where they're often really hindered by grazing. Or wildflowers may do better in urban areas and be greater floral diversity because we're willing to spend the time to weed, as so many of the talks have talked about. We are willing to do that and to plant and weed and create native wildflower meadows that may not be able to survive against the pressures of invasive grasses in the more wildlands. So interestingly, the cities can play a role. Now, we've also been doing research on the ground to understand these concepts here locally. And so this is research in more of an office park than a residential setting, but the same factors of how much pavement, how much trees, how much vegetation. This is a research supported by the Google Urban Ecology Program in collaboration with San Francisco Bird Observatory and H.T. Harvey. And this is really fresh data that we're just analyzing now, but it's really fascinating, so I wanted to share it with you. It shows on the x-axis, so we have two categories, poor and good quality. Horizontally here, we have at the neighborhood scale, how good is the habitat surrounding you? And on the vertical scale, we have how good is the habitat at your site? And of course, when you have poor site and neighborhood habitat quality, you get fewer birds in this case. At least you'll actually get 18 birds. But that's going to be the very common urban exploitive species like crows and pigeons and towhees, relatively common birds. When you improve your site quality, like the kinds of things we're talking about doing in these seminars, more than 50% more birds. These weren't even necessarily as great site improvements as you could imagine. So that number probably can go higher. But then if you go to a place with better surrounding neighborhood quality, but still a very poor quality site, you also have more birds. So interestingly, that can somewhat overcome the limitations of your site. But if you have both good quality site and good quality neighborhood, then you get even more birds. And so I think that's really our goal. And if we only work on our site, we're going to be limited as to what we can accomplish. This data shows that. And of course, it's a spectrum too. You're going from, as I said, sort of your crows and your pigeons to birds you might be more excited to see, like warblers and bluebirds and woodpeckers are the kinds of birds that are showing up more as we move towards these more green conditions. So we start to think about our yard as part of an ecological network, a nature network, if you will. And it's going to be most effective as we think of it as part of a system, which actually I think some of the previous talks have talked about as well, and even what Melissa was doing. And so we've thought then, we've dived into the literature, the research on cities around the world to figure out, well, what are the elements to create that network of nature? And we found that there were 7 major drivers of urban biodiversity that really control how well a city does in supporting wildlife. And so those are, I'll go through them quickly here and then in more detail. Patch size, which is simply how big a patch of green space is, how well connected it is, the little things, yards and street trees in between, the habitat types and structure that you're creating in those sites of green space, the amount of native plants, that's a key driver as we've been discussing, and then certain relatively small features that can be really important in species life cycles, which we call special resources, and then how you manage a kind of catch-all area. So I'm going to go through each one of those briefly and say some of the implications for our work at the local scale. So starting with patch size. So the number one driver of biodiversity in general and urban biodiversity as well is how big a patch is. Bigger patches support more species more effectively. And that's actually one of the kind of classic strongest ecological relationships is a species area curve. And we've looked at that in more detail for urban areas and classified patches in these different levels of benefit that we consider 2 acres and larger to be really called a patch that can support its own self-sustaining species. But then when you get up towards 10 acres, you actually have accumulated a lot more species. And then many more sensitive species are only going to be found when you have these larger regional hubs. Like that's where hedgehogs reproduce in London, is in a large park like that. So those are the kinds of, so we want to think about our area in that context. And here's a little data to show you what I mean. This is looking at breeding bird populations in Rome. And so as you increase the size of the park, as you look at parks of larger size on the x-axis, you can see the number of species dramatically increased, especially as you go from 0 to about, well, there's no park of 0, but from small parks to 4 hectares or so, 10 acres. You started to kind of max out and hit like a threshold of how many birds you could support. So that becomes, you can see, so those are going to be the real drivers as we get these larger parks. And so you can look at your neighborhood, and this is me doing this for my South Berkeley neighborhood, and start to think about what is the ecological landscape or network you are part of. And in our neighborhood, the big drivers of biodiversity are going to be actually UC Berkeley campus, which is 130 acres, larger than 130 acres. It actually does have a lot of great habitats, including Strawberry Creek, a lot of oaks, and they've been actually restoring doing a lot of native landscaping, as well as Claremont Canyon on the right. And so what's happening in these places is going to create sort of the general context for biodiversity in my neighborhood. So being involved as Melissa talked about, in those areas and what's accomplished there is going to make a big difference. But then at your even smaller scale, the local hubs are going to be important. And these in my neighborhood, and probably most neighborhoods, tend to be local parks or schoolyards. And so what's done there can be a big driver. And so for example, at Sylvia Mendez School, there are actually a fair number of native habitats. There's a willow, valley oak, coast live oak, some native habitat areas, and a bunch of areas that actually could provide more habitat. So this really could, in theory, be, as many schools probably could be, a local node that would have more habitat that can ever create in a yard, but then will kind of catalyze biodiversity in the whole neighborhood. So as Melissa again was saying, was volunteering in the kind of land stewardship in the surrounding areas is a key element if you can do that. And I think many schoolyards and parks may be able to do that. And there's real health benefits to children as well from the access to vegetation in terms of immune response and shading and all sorts of things. So another interesting thing when I look at my neighborhood is that the biggest kind of potential area are these medians that are just grassy right now and are within the distance that research shows a larger space can definitely influence a smaller space. So if I really want to drive biodiversity in my yard and neighborhood, probably seeing what could be done there. Of course, these are bigger, longer term processes, but this is how this can be a big part of of one strategy if you really want to be increasing biodiversity. So advocating for and stewarding habitat in nearby green spaces, these will drive biodiversity in your yard. As well as, and this is obviously more challenging, advocating for the creation of new green spaces. Those are going to be rare, but there are many park poor areas in our cities that really do need those and should, for equity, equitable access to green space and nature really should be created. So that's an important element as well. So there's this combination of local and, and surrounding area. So the second big driver of biodiversity in cities are the connections. And I think that kind of makes sense intuitively that you've got your habitat areas, and what's going to make a big difference is how well connected they are. That's going to allow the more mobile species to be more effective at moving back and forth, can take less calories, they're going to have less mortality, and it's going to help the less mobile species like beetles or spiders that are just drifting on threads. It's going to help everybody be more successful and more have more use of the different resources that generally are often not going to be sufficient in the different small spaces, if that makes sense. So ideally, these are greenways and riparian corridors, but often it's going to be more streets along streets or stepping stones. And there's a really wonderful example in San Francisco, led by the nonprofit Nature in the City, called the Green Hare Street Corridor, which you may have heard about, which is a great example. It's taking patches. They identified these habitat patches bigger than 2 acres that support the butterfly, which is rare, almost extirpated in the city, but it can't move between the patches because it is dependent. It can only fly on the order of 200 meters in 200 feet, I think, in a generation, and needs a host plant, be able to find a host plant in that distance. So it literally needs stepping stones of buckwheat or deerweed. And so they've been creating those in between the larger patches to create a corridor. In this case, it's a neat example of a corridor, stepping stones, and also focusing on a particular species where you really can make a difference, which is something I'll talk about more. Another example is a really neat program in Singapore, which is a real leader in urban biodiversity. And here they have identified streets going between 2 significant green spaces, and then they try to max out the native habitat along that street with canopy layer, understory, and actually they supplement the existing street trees with native trees, which is a really neat combination to get more canopy and more high quality habitat. I think they've done this between 29 or so, I forget the exact number, parks connected them in this way. So in summary, to improve connections, we can advocate for greenways and nature ways, which is even a step above, arguably. Habitat is part of bike buffers and the slow streets movement. So we're actually taking advantage of these shifts in mobility to bring in habitat. And then we can also think very locally about our sites as stepping stones and pollinator pathways. Some neat work being done on that concept. And even in my neighborhood, I find that it seems like, as researchers have talked about, that monarchs are heading in a general north-south direction. It does seem that they're generally passing through, hopping from my milkweed to go across the street where we have another milkweed. And so we're starting to try to set up that somewhat linear pathway that a mother monarch could follow, depositing eggs sequentially and have her choice of different spots to lay eggs. So this leads to the idea of matrix quality, which is probably my personal favorite, which is the kind of cumulative benefit of the small areas. And as you can see in these diagrams on the right, those can increase the connectivity between patches. They can essentially, if you're well designed around a park or a habitat patch, they can increase the habitat value or effective functional size of that habitat by having complementary habitat around it. Similarly for riparian corridors, or in the bottom example, we can actually create, functional sort of distributed patches themselves by coordinating across sites. So this idea of combining multiple spaces to create neighborhood nature nodes, because generally most homes aren't going to be right next to a large park or riparian corridor. So we need to create our own nodes of nature, what we call a habitat complex. And this is important because most species are going to need, most wildlife is going to need more than one yard. And so you need coordinated ecological improvements. And these are a few examples from our a report we wrote called Urban Ecological Planning Guide with the Open Space Authority, Silicon Valley Open Space Authority. It's available online. And it looks at a few species like acorn woodpecker or the arboreal salamander, California sister, which can occupy fairly small spaces, but still need a variety of resources like a certain number of oaks or spacing between oaks close enough for the California sister. So we can start to design our yard and think about it in that context to support particular species. And here's a quick personal example of how a habitat complex can start to develop in the neighborhood. This is the corner near my house where we have a traffic circle the city of Berkeley helped us build 15 years ago or so. And it's become a real source of neighborhood pride. You can see it's decorated each holiday season. And the tree we planted that was a seedling oak and is now quite huge and has a bunch of native plants in the understory. And that gave neighbors the idea to start expanding that habitat along the parking strips to sort of radiate out from this little node. And so this parking strip turned into this with California sagebrush and creeping wild rye and ceanothus and blue-eyed grass and a bunch of milkweed, has a lot of caterpillars on it. And that led to our neighbor across the street, this is across the street from us, this is down the street, up the street from us, saying, hey, can we do something similar in our yard, in our parking strip? And then somebody else said, hey, these plants look good, I like these look really nice, could we do that in our yard? So we started to generate a surprising amount of ecology in these really small spaces. And it's continuing to lead towards more and more neighbors joining in. That may be partly because my sons, Joey and Leo, have been really amazing at digging up the weeds and planting the native plants. But it's drawn in, it has, of course, had this whole unexpected community benefit where I've got to know neighbors better. This is a neighbor bringing us seedlings of blue-eyed grass from her yard. And we're putting in bulk orders for mulch and bulk orders for plants, discounts. And cumulatively, we've started to be able to add to, what one can do at one's own yard. And I pretty much have ran out of space to add more native plants. But starting to connect these relatively small parking strips, but cumulatively starting to add up to something. These are the ones in the works as well. And then that has started to lead towards front yards and backyards being turned into native habitat as well. So starting to build a bit of a habitat complex. So this leads towards that idea of coordinating with neighborhoods and combining backyards and front yards and parking strips and street trees. And it's led me to realize an interesting thing, which is while one can generally do more in your backyard because it tends to be bigger and it's like a little more contained, you may get more pure habitat quantity. In a way, the front yard and the parking strip and these little public spaces may have, much greater value because they can have influence and kind of spread throughout the neighborhood. And the somewhat unfortunately named scientific research concept of social contagion, which doesn't sound that good nowadays, but the idea that, of course, what we do around each other influences each other. And that's really been the case here. I think it's just more of sort of a community engagement and like sharing concept. So so thinking about the public facing spaces and the power of that to spread and kind of build interest in these kinds of activities. And then the idea of for particular species, like right now with the crisis in monarch populations, we probably should all be planting as much milkweed as possible, making as much resources as we can. I see people talking about the pipevine swallowtail, and that we may not be able to get enough habitat in your own yard, but if many people did, you might be able to get self-sustaining populations. And then similarly, the acorn woodpecker, and I'll use that'll shift me to this next topic of habitat diversity. And so this is thinking about what are the larger plant communities and ecosystems that we're trying to create, and leads us to thinking about historical ecology as I started. And in the East Bay, we're often going to be thinking about lost habitats are going to be wildflower meadows and grasslands, oak savannas and woodlands, riparian corridors with streams and pools in them, and willow groves in the wetter areas. And so we can start to think about, well, we can't recreate these exact views in our urban landscapes. Think about how we can reintroduce the different elements of them in the different spaces that we have access to. And one example of that is reoaking, where we thought about all the functions and elements, components of an oak woodland ecosystem, and kind of translated that into how could that be accomplished in a neighborhood, in an urban setting. And it's a certain amount of oak trees to create the amount to support an acorn woodpecker colony, which then can create cavities for the cavity nesters like bluebirds. It's having overstory and understory, so that a butterfly, the California sister, that is using oak leaves as a host, has nectar when they're ready for it. You also have the downed logs and leaf litter as part of that ground level. And then the spacing, because oaks actually, their pollen doesn't move that far, so they need to be within a certain distance. So you can start to create an oak node, if you will, by thinking about the different functions. And then actually support like an acorn woodpecker colony in an urban setting, as you do see in places that have enough oaks and these different resources. So some of the elements that we want to think about from a habitat diversity perspective are having both the overstory. The trees are really important. They tend to be drivers. There's so much biomass in a tree that if you can support a tree, particularly an oak or a willow or cottonwood, that's going to be a huge value. But then often the understory is missing, or the shrubs are really important in research, that sort of vertical structure. And then thinking about the larger functional ecosystems that we might be able to create. It could be oak savannas in the lowlands, wildflower meadows, pollinator gardens in the open sunny areas like that our example along the street. If you're near a creek, aiming for riparian trees and understory plants, because those corridors are often really restrained, so you can somewhat compensate for that by what you do in your yards. And if you do have a high water table or other good water source, willows and cottonwoods, those grows are really real oases, particularly in the late summer. So if you can plant willows, they always show up as one of the highest value species in the butterfly host plants and pretty much every other metric, providing those. And for insectivorous birds, late in the summer, those leaves are really palatable. So thinking about the habitats that we're creating. Now, I won't spend much time on native vegetation because we've talked about that a lot in these seminars, and people are doing amazing things to meet all of these goals. But I will reinforce this point that I think Doug Tallamy made really well with his research, and this research from Melbourne, residential Melbourne, shows similarly the kind of remarkable increase in the presence of native species and across many different types of wildlife as you go from 10 to 60, really up to the 50 and 60% native vegetation. You can see the dramatic increases in bees, the blue line, beetles, the dashed orangish line, bats in the red, bugs, true bugs in the black line, and native birds in the yellow line, all going dramatically up as the proportion of native plants increases. And then correspondingly, the amount of exotic non-native birds dramatically went down. So you can see why scientists are putting out goals like 60 or 70, or you can see these numbers seem to still be going up for some of these fauna. Aiming for, the majority native plants is really going to drive ecosystem biodiversity. So as we think about the plants we're planting, thinking about their wildlife value, And one great source is the work of Doug Tallamy and Calscape that can help you figure out which plants are best for caterpillar host plants, which does have that cascading benefit for birds. You also take it another level and think about other species by looking at eBird and iNaturalist and seeing what's in your neighborhood and could be supported. And you can look at species assemblages, like aiming for multiple species of oaks in your neighborhood, because they tend to produce acorns in different years. So it's important to have a mix. Providing nectar and pollen continuously as much as possible, in particular late and early season nectar, which can be important and kind of a limiting factor. And then perhaps a number of researchers point to having clumps or drifts of species, not just one of every plant, but trying to aim for somewhat larger patches so that it's less energetic cost for species, bees or butterflies to take advantage of those, and actually easier to find and recognize as well. And support things like this ruby-crowned kinglet that my son Leo took a picture of. Special resources are next to the last item. Are things like ponds or large trees, small water features that can be really critical for species life cycles. So large trees can have the cavities and the dead wood, which can also be sources of cavities and insects, and may be easier to preserve on private land where you can keep a piece or actually put some effort into keeping these elements in your yard while making sure to be careful in terms of safety. And then, as has been discussed, the value of bird boxes and bee boxes and those sorts of things can be quite significant. You want to research a little bit which work well in your area. And then water features, we have relatively recently put in pond in our backyard, which is sort of still coming together. Joey nicely took this picture just this morning. And even in just sort of incipient form, it's attracted so many more species than we saw before. Golden crowned sparrows bathing a lot a month ago. The black phoebes, dragonflies, which we hadn't seen before. And you can imagine that there used to be these streams in, fairly regularly spaced in the East Bay, which would have pools and, in spots over the summer. And just most of those are gone today. So you can imagine water is a real limiting resource, probably in many places. And so providing that can be valuable. And then I had to put this in, just very small special resources like this hole in our somewhat dilapidated, it's secure, don't get me wrong, but older wood on the deck, which is used by this carpenter bee, and a number of them using these holes in the deck. And they've become a real source of enjoyment for us as a family. And I haven't been able to successfully create more holes that they've used, but we have recognized things to do to make those holes safer, like not having water, a pail of water nearby that it might fall into, keeping the cat, this is upstairs, but keeping the cat away from it. And just maintaining those small resources, getting to know them and seeing how wildlife are even using your structure. So some of these actions include preserving old trees with cavities and deadwood, all these sorts of features for nesting, like bee boxes and bat boxes, which are super popular in England, and bee hotels. And then as Kathy and Melissa were talking about, logs, dead logs, sticks, stick piles, leaf litter, and then ponds, mud puddles for butterflies to get nutrients, sand baths sometimes. Some of these features that can actually make a difference. And then my last element to discuss is management. This is a number of different things which I think people have been talking about quite a bit in these sessions. But the one I'll focus on, because it's getting a lot more attention recently, is light pollution. In this recent paper, it as a driver of insect decline. But also because it's somewhat tractable. It's somewhat something that we actually can, like native plants, deal with at a local scale. And so the major factors to consider are the type of light. And this graphic shows how shielding light fixtures would just point the light down, are going to waste much less light and focus it where you need it and have less light pollution. of course, what's even better is having as little light as you really need, or have it on as little as you need with motion activated sensor lights. So that's the first step. And then the second step is what bulbs you're actually using, or what kind of light you have, because it's the blue and white side of the spectrum, which is much worse for both wildlife and for humans. And much of the research is actually about the effect on our own circadian rhythms. And that's why, you know, looking at screens before you go to bed is not good. So similarly, just not being surrounded by bluish light is going to be better for people. And we want to get bulbs that are down in the 3000 or 2700 Kelvin temperature. And I have been noticing those are more available in, you know, in the hardware stores. So it's just, if we all switch those out with those light fixtures over time, it make a pretty big difference in our neighborhoods. So particularly on insects. So reducing light pollution, darksky.org is a great resource, and they actually have links to specific fixtures you can buy. Bird safe windows, we tend to think about more for office buildings, migratory birds, but can be an issue, you know, on one's own house, particularly if you're creating more habitat. You want to be aware of bird strikes and the treatments you can do on your windows. Noise pollution is an interesting one that I think we all became much more aware of during the pandemic, when it just got so amazingly quiet. And the birds, research definitely showed birds taking advantage of that. That is somewhat hard to change at a local scale, but so hopefully these trends of slow streets and electric cars, fewer combustion engines, will actually gradually remove that major constraint on wildlife, and as well as human health, make our neighborhoods quieter, which is going to add a whole nother dimension that's possible for urban biodiversity. And then the last bullet there is, I think, things we've discussed a lot in these sessions about how you maintain your landscape in terms of when you weed and prune and deadheading and leaving seeds and leaf litter and all those sorts of things. So in conclusion, as we think about our yard as being part of a node in the nature network, we might want to think about what's nearby, particular target species to guide us, aiming for cumulative benefits across the neighborhood, sort of the synergistic effect. And that's part of creating ecosystems, really creating ecosystems, not just planting plants. So thinking about, you know, the larger patterns, all the different resources, you know, special resources, water features, nesting resources, thinking really about ecosystems. And that's where what we're really trying to do. And that's really challenging and complex, but I think we're hoping to provide some ways to start doing that. And I think many, as has been exemplified in all these yards we've been seeing. So in conclusion, I wanted to leave you with a few resources. The first few are available on our website at the Urban Nature Lab at SFEI. There's a great report done by H.T. Harvey and Google called Integrating Nature into the Urban Landscape that I think people would really love. Just Google that. Maybe we could put that resource, that link on there. Calscape is an amazing resource. And Homegrown National Park, which leads to all of Doug Tallamy's research on butterfly hosts and moth hosts. And then Bringing Back Natives, you've got a lot of great resources on this website as well. So I want to thank many colleagues at SFEI and collaborators in other entities and partners and funders in this work. And finally, thank you all for watching and being interested and invested. This is a case where individual actions really can make a difference. So thank you.
Okay, Robin, thank you very much. So we have a number of questions, and I look forward to talking with you for the next few minutes. So let's see, the dark skies at night. I had not heard of dark skies at night until I heard Doug Tallamy's talk. And for those of you who have not heard Doug Tallamy speak, if you go to the Garden Tours YouTube page, Doug Tallamy was the keynote speaker for this tour on April 25th, and he gave a slightly different but same message talk last year. It's also on the tour's YouTube page, and he is such an inspirational and informative speaker. So I just encourage people to go there and hear him speak. But we ourselves, after hearing him, got dark skies at night certified lights. So you can buy them at Home Depot, and it's just a light that has a cap on it. So the light shines down, not up. And we even were able to get one. We're required now with a new remodel to have our numbers to be lit from the street, but we were able to find a number sign that also had the little cap on it. So it meets the criteria. And we have motion sensors, so we don't leave our night lights on at night. We use our motion sensors. And can I say something about bird strikes? We just did this big remodel, so we tried to think of all these things as we were working on our house. We put in double hung windows specifically because we could get exterior screens. Casement windows don't have exterior screens, and birds won't fly into windows with exterior screens. They don't see the glare. So we put up our double hung windows and screens. And then for our big picture window, we found from a company called Collide Escape, like I'm going to escape a collision, Collide Escape, a bird screen that can go over a large picture window that functions as a screen. And so we have buried, we hope, our last bird here on Hillcrest Road. So we did have on the garden tour, have had for a number of years, a cluster of sort of habitat nodes, as you called them, in Richmond. It was Dave Drummond and Margot Cunningham, Anita Pereira and Paul Carr, who worked together. They're within a few houses of each other in the Richmond Annex to help each other with their own gardens. And then they began gardening and helping neighbors up and down the street. And so I'm familiar with their project. But Robin, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the community aspects? Like, how did it happen? How did you get neighbors who wouldn't normally think about putting natives in their garden to do so?
Yeah, right. Good question. That's great. I'm going to reach out to Margo about, I knew she'd done amazing things. So that could be a good example for us. When I saw a question on this, you know, our approach has been just kind of somewhat unintentional. It's just sort of happened pretty organically. I think from being out there on the street, it's interesting how much people appreciate improving the streetscape, like improving these crappy parking strips. You know, you get a lot of people stopping by and asking questions, and I think observing what's happening. And then, so we didn't ask any neighbors to do this. It was all people saying, well, could we do that on mine? I just have this crappy grassy area, you know. I've been wondering what to do. You know, I think a lot of these people don't know like what plants to do or how to do it, and maybe don't know if it's going to look good or not. So I think we realized we have to make sure they keep looking good for it to be successful. But it has purely been organic, just people you know, being curious and then saying, hey, can I do that so far? In fact, to your point, the one time I have tried to be more pushy and didactic, that didn't go anywhere. You know, because they are people's yards, and people are very, you know, have their own desires and wishes. But I do think it's interesting, the front yard and the parking strip as a semi-public space, maybe as a place that's safe to kind of, it's sort of in between, you know, public and private. And so I think maybe that's been part of what's worked for us, is that that's a good place to collaborate. And then that maybe leads people to want to do more of that in their own personal space.
I know with Dave Drummond and Margot and Anita, they began by working on their own yards, but they were also all of them great propagators, and they gave plants away to their neighbors. And
that's
even
a great point.
Started planting some of their neighbors. Like if the neighbor just wasn't invested in their parking strip, they just began kind of working themselves up and down the street. They also held open houses, open gardens, where they would, you know, offer neighborhood tours. And Dave told me that one time they had 30 people coming through on their little neighborhood tour, and they had success with both of their own effort with gardening on other people's parking strips. And then some people also became interested and changed their own gardens.
Yeah, well, that, you know, that's probably, to be fair, probably part of it has been that I have two sons, 10 and 15, Leo and Joey, who have also offered to dig up people's parking strips and plant them. So that is pretty irresistible, I think, if you got these motivated, like people actually do it for you. And so that has been I think, yeah, a little bit of help probably. And, you know, that's been fun for us because we have a small lot and don't have that much space to work with. So to get to try out different things and actually have a bigger room to work with people on, that's been
It
really
sounds like
fun.
a good way to meet your neighbors too. Have you met more friends and more
Well,
neighbors?
that's the thing. I know I hadn't realized it's actually even maybe more exciting. I'm really into native plants, obviously. Like that's my whole, like, you know, focus. But it's probably been even more exciting than neighborhood relationships. Like, yeah, it really is true. Urban greening, and there's a lot of research about urban greening and the value of that for social interactions. And then the health benefits of that. And it's really true. Like you end up sharing things more and like helping each other out when you're away from vacation or and some of those relationships are developed because of doing these little projects together, you know, giving each other lemons, you know, borrowing tools, all the sort of things that actually are part of community resilience and stuff. I think that's been in some ways the even more exciting part. I mean, equally exciting to the ecology of it.
So there's a question here about how close do oaks need to be planted to be close enough for the California sister butterfly?
I think what we cited in re-oaking Silicon Valley, the report which gets into this more, is on the order of 500 meters. So it's, you know, it's hundreds of feet away. So, and that number is also though thinking about the pollen distance, the distance that pollen goes. So oaks are wind pollinated, of course, but surprisingly, the pollen doesn't go that far. And so if you have oaks that are, you know, thousands of feet apart, they are pretty much isolated from each other. So there's so interesting research about that. So that proximity is important both for the butterfly and for the oaks themselves to be healthy and produce.
For people who did not watch the last couple of weeks, Doug Tallamy spoke on April the 25th and gave his great talk. On May the 2nd, I gave a talk on keystone species from the San Francisco Bay Area using Dr. Tallamy's data and described some of the species that we could use on May 2nd on shady areas. And on May 16th, I gave a similar talk on our own local keystone species, which are the plants that are the most valuable for wildlife for sunny areas. So you could also find some information there. And we also have on the homepage of the garden tour, a link called Doug Tallamy Resources. And if you go there and click into that link, you'll find Doug Tallamy's list of the Bay Area plants and the number of species of butterflies and moths that can lay eggs on those, and several other plant lists that would be useful for you when you're thinking about creating your own garden as a habitat node and kind of branching out from there. Let's see.
I'm just reading all the comments. A lot of fascinating stuff.
Well, feel free, and you see something you want to respond to, Robin, I'm reading them too. Attracting native birds. You need native plants to attract native birds. Didn't you talk about that a little bit, Robin, with the number of birds that you can attract, or the number of species, not the number of birds, but it's the number of species of birds, right? I know. Well, go ahead.
You mean the Melbourne research that I showed? Yeah. That was the occupancy, the likelihood of finding a species in your site. And it was kind of it was a really interesting study because it was bees, butterflies, true bugs, bats, you know, so it goes beyond just the butterfly stuff. It showed that the benefits across all these different categories of wildlife. So that's pretty neat. So, you know, I think this debate about native and non-native is always challenging. And of course, there are non-native plants that can, every plant probably has some value, and some have more than others, some non-natives. But I think the research is pretty clear that in general, native species are going to support many more native wildlife species. And it is, it's not that you necessarily want to get rid of all non-native species, but the more you can shift that proportion to the native species, it's just going to support more native wildlife. And I think Doug Tallamy, he explains it really well, just in terms of the adaptation. It's tough to digest leaves. And like, we can't eat most of these leaves of non-native or native plants. So they have fairly specialized abilities to digest plants that are based on evolutionary relationships. And so many of the non-native plants we plant are essentially like plastic plants for wildlife. They're just not edible. So they're not useful. You know, they may be still useful for structure and carbon storage and cooling and some of the other benefits, but you would do better to have native plants doing those benefits and supporting the ecosystem.
No, we saw that in our own yard when I first moved into this house, and we had lawn, ivy, weird South African plants, Himalayan blackberry. And then after we changed our garden, and we didn't see anything really going on in the backyard at the time, but since we converted our garden to natives, we have seen 30 species of birds in my little lot in San Pablo. It's been very exciting.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, there was a question about window treatments, and that's a kind of complicated topic. You gave a good example of window treatment, and there are, you know, surface, you know, decals or
Screening.
yeah, you know, screens, yeah, or lines that you can put on post facto. Because yeah, getting, you know, I think a lot of cities are pushing for like the larger office buildings to get that hardwired into the glass, right? So there's it's called frit. So there are these kind of imperceptible lines, grids that birds see.
Mm-hmm.
That's generally, I don't see people generally doing that with residential buildings, but you know, if you do have a window, you might want some treatment on it.
Well,
and American Bird Conservancy is the source, ABC, for a lot of the research and guidance on that. So that's a website maybe that could be put up. Kind of equivalent
we had
to
a big
Dark Sky.
bird collision problem at our house before we remodeled, and we buried 3 birds in 6 months. And so we were determined when we moved back into the house, we will have buried our last bird. So we haven't had any collisions since we've been back home with our kaleidoscope screening and our screening on the double hung windows, which has really been a relief. Well, Robin, we are, I am sorry to say, out of time, but it was great to have you with us today. Might you be able to stick around and answer some of these questions on Zoom or YouTube?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to keep looking at these questions. Thanks, everyone, for all the great comments.
Well, thank you so much
for
taking the time to be with us today. It's nice to have you. See you again, Robin.
Likewise. Okay, take care.
So I'd like to thank 4 Dimensions Landscape Company for supporting the tour. If you're interested in converting your garden to natives, I always recommend that people work with a company that specializes in designing native plant gardens, and also that you let the designer know you want a native plant garden. If you would like help designing and installing a native plant garden, you might want to contact 4 Dimensions Landscape Company. 4 Dimensions is an award-winning landscape design company whose motto is restoring the earth one garden at a time, and whose goal it is to bring people and nature together. 4 Dimensions creates well-planned, carefully crafted environments that enrich both human and natural life. You can call on 4 Dimensions to design, build, or nurture your garden, and you can reach them at 4dimensionslandscape.com or 510-893-1999.